They said her father was a traitor. They said she deserved nothing. Not a home, not a family, not even a seat inside the schoolhouse. On the coldest day of winter, 12-year-old Emily Harper was thrown out into the snow with nowhere to go and no one willing to stand beside her. But hidden beneath her coat hung an old military medal. And inside that forgotten piece of bronze lay a secret powerful enough to shake an entire town. A secret that would force the people of Dry Creek to confront a lie they had lived with for 20 years. This is the story of an orphan girl, a lonely blacksmith, and the truth that refused to stay buried. The winter wind swept across the frontier town of Dry Creek, carrying dust, snow, and whispers through the narrow streets. Most children had already rushed home after the final school bell rang, eager to escape the cold and join their families around warm supper tables. But one child remained standing alone in front of the weathered schoolhouse. 12-year-old Emily Harper clutched a worn canvas satchel against her chest while icy gusts tugged at her threadbare coat. She watched the other children disappear one by one into the fading afternoon light. Some glanced back at her. A few whispered. None approached. Emily had grown accustomed to that. In Dry Creek, loneliness had become as familiar as breathing. The schoolhouse door creaked open behind her. Miss Clara Turner stepped onto the porch, her expression softening when she noticed Emily still standing there. "Emily," she said gently, "you should be heading home before dark." The girl lowered her eyes toward the frozen ground. "I don't have a home anymore, ma'am." The teacher's face tightened with sadness. Everyone in town knew the story. 3 months earlier, Emily's father, Sergeant Benjamin Harper, had died in a prison cell. The newspapers had called him a traitor. The town called him a coward. Years ago, during the war, Benjamin Harper had been accused of abandoning his unit during a critical battle. The accusation had followed him for decades, poisoning every chance he had to rebuild his life. When he died, few people mourned him. Fewer still cared what happened to the daughter he left behind. Unable to pay rent, Emily had been forced from the small cabin where she had lived with her father. Since then, she survived wherever she could find shelter. Some nights she slept in abandoned barns. Other nights she curled up beneath church porches or inside empty wagons. Hunger followed her everywhere. So did the stares. Miss Turner reached into her coat pocket and handed Emily a small piece of bread wrapped in cloth. "Take this," she whispered. "It's all I have today." Emily accepted it with trembling hands. "Thank you." Before either could say more, another voice cut through the cold air. "Still feeding her, Miss Turner?" Both turned. Walking across the street came Councilman Victor Grayson, accompanied by 2 wealthy ranchers. Victor was one of the most powerful men in Dry Creek, and he carried himself as though he owned every building, horse, and soul within 50 miles. He stopped in front of Emily and looked down at her with open contempt. "The school day is over," he said. "Why are you still here?" Emily tightened her grip on the satchel. "I was leaving. You should have left already." Miss Turner stepped forward. "She's done nothing wrong." Victor barely acknowledged her. "This school is for decent families, not the daughter of a disgraced traitor." Emily felt the familiar sting in her chest. No matter how many times she heard those words, they never hurt less. "My father wasn't a traitor," she whispered. The ranchers laughed. Victor's expression hardened. "The court decided that long ago. The court was wrong." For a moment the street fell silent. Then Victor smiled coldly. "Perhaps you've inherited your father's talent for lying." Miss Turner moved between them. "That's enough." But Victor had already spotted something around Emily's neck. A leather cord disappeared beneath her coat. The girl instinctively covered it with one hand. That small movement caught his attention immediately. "What's hidden under there?" he asked. Emily said nothing. "Show me." "No." "Why not?" "Because it belongs to my father." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Then it's probably stolen." One of the ranchers chuckled. "Or worthless." Emily stepped backward. The medal hanging beneath her coat was the last thing her father had given her. She would never let anyone take it. "Leave me alone." Victor looked toward the schoolhouse. "Miss Turner, I warned you before. The town council decided this girl is no longer welcome here." The teacher froze. "What?" "Her presence causes trouble. Parents have complained." Effective immediately, Emily Harper is expelled from this school. Emily stared at him. For a moment she thought she had misheard. School was the only place where she occasionally felt safe, the only place where she could sit beside a warm stove and forget, if only for an hour, that she was completely alone. Miss Turner looked horrified. "You can't do that. The council already has." He pulled a folded paper from his coat and handed it to her. "Signed this morning." Emily watched the color drain from the teacher's face as she read the document. It was real. Victor smiled. "Gather your things, girl. You won't be returning." The words struck harder than the winter wind. Around them, a few townspeople had stopped to watch. None spoke in her defense. None objected. Emily felt every eye upon her. She picked up her satchel and turned away before anyone could see the tears forming in her eyes. The laughter behind her followed her down the street. She ran until she reached the edge of town where an abandoned stable stood beside a frozen creek. The roof leaked. The walls barely blocked the wind. But it was the closest thing she had to a home. Emily sat in a corner and finally pulled the object from beneath her coat. It was a bronze military medal attached to a faded ribbon. The medal was scratched and worn from years of use. Her father had given it to her shortly before his arrest. She still remembered his voice. "Keep this safe, Emily. One day the truth will matter." At the time, she had not understood what he meant. Now those words haunted her. She traced the edge of the medal with her thumb and stared into the gathering darkness. If her father was innocent, why had nobody believed him? Why had everyone abandoned them? Why had he died alone? Outside, the wind howled through the prairie. Snow drifted across the frozen ground. Miles away, another man rode toward Dry Creek. Sparks flew from the horseshoes as they struck patches of stone along the road. The rider was broad-shouldered, his hands blackened by years of work beside a forge. Jacob Walker, the town's blacksmith, was returning from a neighboring settlement after delivering repaired wagon parts. He expected nothing more than a quiet evening. He did not know that before sunrise he would meet an orphan girl carrying a forgotten military medal. He did not know that the medal belonged to a soldier he once admired. And he certainly did not know that the small piece of bronze hidden beneath Emily Harper's coat would unravel a lie that had poisoned Dry Creek for nearly 20 years. As darkness settled over the frontier, fate quietly began moving both of them toward the same path, and neither would ever be the same again. The night grew colder as snow drifted across the empty prairie surrounding Dry Creek. Inside the abandoned stable, Emily Harper pulled her thin coat tighter around herself and curled into a corner beside a pile of old hay. The piece of bread Miss Turner had given her was already gone. Hunger still gnawed at her stomach, but years of hardship had taught her how to ignore it. What she could not ignore was the loneliness. The stable creaked with every gust of wind. Shadows shifted between the broken boards. Somewhere outside, a coyote howled. Emily wrapped her fingers around the bronze military medal hanging from her neck and closed her eyes. Whenever she felt afraid, she thought about her father. She remembered evenings when they sat beside the small stove in their cabin while he told stories about courage, loyalty, and honor. The townspeople remembered Benjamin Harper as a traitor. Emily remembered him as the only person who had ever truly loved her. Tears slipped down her cheeks before sleep finally claimed her. At dawn, the sound of horses awakened her. Emily sat up immediately. Through a gap in the stable wall, she saw several riders entering town. One wagon carried a shipment of timber. Another hauled sacks of grain. The town was beginning another day. She waited until the riders disappeared before leaving her shelter. The cold morning air stung her face. With nowhere else to go, she wandered toward the center of Dry Creek. Her stomach ached from hunger. She hoped someone might need help carrying supplies or cleaning stalls in exchange for a meal. Most people ignored her. Others stared openly. Emily lowered her head and continued walking. Near the center of town stood Jacob Walker's blacksmith shop. The steady rhythm of hammer-striking steel echoed across the street. Sparks flew from the forge as Jacob worked on a wagon wheel. At 48 years old, Jacob Walker was one of the most respected men in Dry Creek. He was known for honest work, fair prices, and keeping mostly to himself. His broad shoulders and scarred hands reflected decades spent beside fire and iron. Few people knew much about his past. Fewer knew that he had served briefly under Sergeant Benjamin Harper during the final years of the war. Jacob had not thought about Benjamin in years. As Emily passed the shop, the smell of fresh bread drifted from a nearby bakery. Her stomach growled painfully. She paused outside the window. Warm loaves sat neatly arranged on wooden shelves. For a moment, she simply stared. The baker noticed her and immediately frowned. "Move along," he snapped. Emily stepped away without protest. She was accustomed to rejection. Across the street, Jacob glanced up from his work and saw the exchange. Something about the girl's expression caught his attention. Not anger, not resentment, just exhaustion. The look of someone who had stopped expecting kindness. He watched her continue down the road until she disappeared around a corner. Then he returned to his forge. Yet the image lingered in his mind. Meanwhile, trouble was already gathering elsewhere in town. Councilman Victor Grayson sat inside the general store speaking with several influential men. They discussed land, cattle prices, and upcoming elections. Eventually, the conversation shifted toward Emily Harper. "The girl's becoming a problem," one rancher said. "People feel sorry for her." Victor's face hardened. "Sympathy leads to questions." Another man nodded. "And questions lead to trouble." Victor drummed his fingers against the table. "Benjamin Harper's story ended years ago. That's how it must remain." The men exchanged uneasy looks. None of them seemed comfortable discussing the subject. Victor noticed. "We cannot allow old rumors to resurface." No one argued. Because all of them remembered the trial. All of them remembered how quickly Benjamin Harper had been condemned. And some remembered details that never appeared in court records. Back outside, Emily spent most of the morning searching for odd jobs. Every request ended the same way. Rejection. One shopkeeper claimed he had no work. Another told her customers would complain if she stayed nearby. A ranch owner simply slammed the door in her face. By midday, she had earned nothing. Snow began falling again. Emily sat alone beside a water trough near the edge of town. She stared at her reflection in the frozen surface and wondered how much longer she could survive like this. Suddenly, she heard shouting. Two boys raced down the street chasing each other. One accidentally collided with her shoulder. Emily fell backward into the snow. The younger boy immediately stopped. "I'm sorry," he said. Before Emily could answer, the older brother grabbed him by the arm. "Don't talk to her." "But it was my fault. Come on." The younger boy glanced back apologetically as they disappeared. Emily remained sitting in the snow long after they were gone. Not because the fall had hurt, because she had seen fear in the older boy's eyes. Fear that simply speaking to her might cause trouble. By late afternoon, the storm worsened. Most townspeople hurried indoors. Emily found herself once again near Jacob Walker's blacksmith shop. The forge glowed brightly through the open doorway. Warmth spilled onto the street. She paused nearby, trying to enjoy the heat for a few moments before moving on. Jacob noticed her standing there. He watched as she extended her hands toward the warmth. The gesture reminded him painfully of hungry children he had seen during the war. Without thinking, he stepped outside. Emily immediately prepared to leave. "Wait," Jacob said. The girl froze. Few adults ever addressed her kindly. Jacob studied her face more closely. She looked thinner than he remembered from previous years, more tired, more alone. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. Emily hesitated. A little. The answer told him everything. Jacob nodded toward the forge. "Come warm yourself for a minute." Emily blinked in surprise. "Really?" "Really." She stepped cautiously inside. The heat felt wonderful against her frozen skin. For several minutes, neither spoke. Jacob returned to shaping iron while Emily sat quietly near the fire. Then his eyes drifted toward the leather cord hanging around her neck. The bronze metal had slipped partly from beneath her coat. Something about its shape seemed strangely familiar. Jacob narrowed his eyes. He had seen countless military decorations during and after the war, but this one stirred an old memory. Before he could look closer, voices erupted outside. Councilman Victor Grayson appeared in the doorway. His expression darkened immediately when he saw Emily. "What is she doing here?" Jacob straightened slowly, warming herself. Victor stepped inside. "She's not welcome." Emily lowered her head. The familiar humiliation returned instantly. But Jacob did not look away this time. He looked from Victor to the metal hanging around the girl's neck, then back again. For the first time in years, an old suspicion stirred deep inside him, because he suddenly recognized the metal. And if he was right, everything Dry Creek believed about Benjamin Harper might be built upon a lie. Jacob Walker stood motionless beside the forge as Councilman Victor Grayson glared at him from the doorway. The heat from the fire filled the blacksmith shop, but the atmosphere had suddenly become colder than the winter storm outside. Emily Harper remained seated near the forge, her eyes fixed on the floor. She had heard this conversation many times before. Someone would show a moment of kindness, and sooner or later Victor Grayson would appear to remind them why helping her was dangerous. But this time felt different. Jacob's attention was no longer focused on Victor. It remained fixed on the bronze medal hanging around Emily's neck. The more he studied it, the more certain he became. He had seen that medal before, not in a newspaper, not during a ceremony. He had seen it on the uniform of Sergeant Benjamin Harper himself. Years ago, before Benjamin became the most hated man in Dry Creek, he had been one of the most respected soldiers in the region. Jacob remembered him clearly. Back then, Jacob had been a young farrier assigned to repair cavalry horses near a military encampment. Benjamin Harper had earned a reputation for bravery during several dangerous operations. Men trusted him. Officers praised him. And then, almost overnight, everything changed. The accusation came. A mission failed. Several soldiers died. Benjamin was blamed. The trial was swift. The verdict even swifter. After that, no one spoke in his defense. At least not publicly. Yet Jacob remembered something that had always troubled him. The story never quite made sense. "She's leaving," Victor said sharply. "Now." Jacob finally looked up. "Why?" Victor frowned. "Why?" "She's warming herself by the fire. That's all she's trouble." Jacob folded his arms. "Looks more like a hungry child to me." Victor's jaw tightened. "You know exactly who she is." "I do." "Then you know why she isn't welcome." The blacksmith's eyes drifted once more toward the metal. "Maybe I don't know as much as I thought." The words caused a brief flicker of concern to cross Victor's face. It vanished almost instantly. Emily noticed it. So did Jacob. The councilman quickly recovered. "This town settled that matter years ago. Did it?" Jacob asked quietly. Victor took a step forward. "Be careful, Walker." "About what?" "Digging up old graves." The warning hung heavily in the air. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Victor turned toward Emily. "Get out." Emily slowly rose to her feet. Habit told her to obey. Before she could move, Jacob spoke again. "She stays until the storm passes." Victor stared at him. "You don't get to decide that." "Actually," Jacob replied calmly, "inside my shop, I do." The councilman looked ready to argue further. Instead, he turned and stormed out into the snow. The two ranchers who accompanied him followed immediately. Once they were gone, silence returned. Emily kept staring toward the open doorway. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jacob frowned. "For what?" "Causing trouble." The blacksmith shook his head. "You didn't cause it." Emily wasn't convinced. Trouble seemed to follow her everywhere. Jacob returned to his workbench and picked up a horseshoe. For several minutes, only the sounds of hammer strikes filled the room. Finally, he spoke without looking up. "May I see the medal?" Emily instinctively grabbed the leather cord. Her father had warned her never to let anyone take it. Yet there was something different about Jacob. He wasn't staring at the medal with greed or suspicion. He looked genuinely curious. After a moment, she slowly removed it from beneath her coat and handed it over. Jacob turned the bronze decoration over in his hands. Time had worn away some details, but the inscription remained visible. His pulse quickened. It was exactly as he remembered. Then he noticed something unusual, a tiny seam along the back edge. He frowned. That shouldn't be there. Carefully, he examined the metal beneath the forge light. It appeared slightly thicker than most military decorations, almost as though something had been hidden inside. "Did your father ever tell you where he got this?" Jacob asked. Emily shook her head. "Only that it was important." "Did he say why?" "No." Jacob ran his thumb across the edge again. The seam was definitely intentional. His curiosity deepened. Before he could investigate further, Another voice entered the shop. Jacob? Both turned. Miss Clara Turner stood in the doorway, snow covering her coat. Relief washed across her face when she saw Emily safe inside. "There you are," she said. "I've been looking everywhere." Emily smiled faintly. Miss Turner approached and lowered her voice. Victor visited the school again. Jacob wasn't surprised. "What did he want?" The teacher hesitated. "He warned me not to help her anymore." Jacob laughed bitterly. "Of course he did." Miss Turner looked toward the medal in his hands. "What is it?" Jacob explained what he remembered about Benjamin Harper's military service. The teacher listened carefully. When he finished, she seemed troubled. "That doesn't sound like the man everyone described." "No," Jacob agreed. "It doesn't." Emily looked between them. "You knew my father?" "Not well," Jacob admitted. "But I knew enough." The girl leaned forward. "Do you think he was innocent?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he looked into her hopeful eyes. "I think there are pieces of the story that were never told." It wasn't a complete answer. But it was the first hopeful thing anyone had ever said about Benjamin Harper. Emily felt tears gathering again. Not from sadness this time. From something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. As evening approached, Miss Turner offered to let Emily stay in a spare room behind the schoolhouse despite Victor's warnings. Emily gratefully accepted. Before leaving, she turned back toward Jacob. "Thank you." The blacksmith nodded. "Keep the metal safe?" She smiled faintly and followed Miss Turner into the storm. Once they were gone, Jacob locked the shop and sat alone beside the dying forge. The metal's strange seam refused to leave his thoughts. Eventually, he crossed the room and retrieved an old military ledger from a shelf. Dust covered the leather binding. He had not opened it in years. Slowly, he began turning pages. Names, dates, unit assignments, commendations. Then he found it. Benjamin Harper. Jacob's eyes widened. Beneath Benjamin's name was a notation he had never noticed before. A recommendation for a bravery award filed only weeks before the mission that supposedly exposed him as a traitor. The document made no sense. Why would the army recommend a man for extraordinary courage and then accuse him of cowardice almost immediately afterward? The contradiction gnawed at him. Someone had lied. The question was who? Outside, the storm intensified. Across town, Victor Grayson sat alone inside his office, staring into a whiskey glass. One of the ranchers entered quietly. Walker recognized the medal. Victor's face darkened. "I was afraid of that. What should we do?" For several moments, Victor said nothing. Then he looked toward the snow-covered window. "Make sure he stops asking questions." Back at the blacksmith shop, Jacob continued reading late into the night, unaware that his search for the truth had already made him a target. Somewhere hidden within Benjamin Harper's past lay a secret powerful enough to frighten some of the most influential men in Dry Creek. And for the first time in nearly 20 years, that secret was beginning to surface. The next morning dawned gray and bitterly cold. Snow still covered the rooftops of Dry Creek, and a thin layer of ice clung to every fence, wagon wheel, and hitching post in town. Emily Harper woke before sunrise in the small storage room behind the schoolhouse where Miss Turner had allowed her to sleep. It was the warmest place she had rested in months. For the first time in a very long while, she had not spent the night listening to the wind whistle through broken boards. Yet despite the warmth, she found herself unable to sleep. Hope had returned to her life, and hope could be frightening. For years, she had accepted the town's judgment of her father because everyone around her believed the same thing. Now, for the first time, two adults had suggested something different. Jacob Walker believed there were unanswered questions. Miss Turner believed the truth might not be what everyone thought. Those small possibilities occupied Emily's mind as she stared at the ceiling. Across town, Jacob Walker had barely slept at all. He remained inside the blacksmith shop long after midnight, studying military records by lantern light. The document he had found continued to trouble him. Benjamin Harper had been recommended for a bravery citation shortly before the mission that supposedly exposed him as a coward. Such a contradiction should have been impossible. Shortly after sunrise, he decided to visit someone who might remember more than he did. Dr. Elias Bennett had lived in Dry Creek longer than almost anyone. Now 70 years old, the town doctor spent most of his days treating minor illnesses and sharing stories nobody bothered to listen to anymore. If anyone remembered the events surrounding Benjamin Harper's trial, it would be him. Jacob arrived at the doctor's small office just after breakfast. The old physician looked surprised to see him. Jacob Walker asking questions before noon? Doctor, Bennett joked. This must be serious. Jacob sat across from him and placed the military ledger on the desk. What do you remember about Benjamin Harper? The doctor's smile faded instantly. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair and sighed. More than most people. Did you ever believe he was guilty? Dr. Bennett stared out the window toward the snowy street. No. Jacob felt his pulse quicken. Why not? The old man folded his hands together. Because I treated the survivors from that mission. And? Their stories never matched. Jacob leaned forward. What do you mean? One soldier claimed Harper abandoned them. Another claimed he was last seen riding toward danger, not away from it. The blacksmith frowned. Did anyone investigate the contradiction? Dr. Bennett laughed bitterly. The army needed someone to blame. Benjamin became convenient. Silence filled the room. Outside, a wagon rattled past. Inside, Jacob felt old suspicions hardening into certainty. Why didn't anyone speak up? He asked. The doctor's expression darkened. Some tried. What happened? Most of them left town. Jacob sat quietly for several moments. Then he revealed something else. Emily still has his medal. The doctor's eyes widened immediately. The Bronze Cavalry Medal? You remember it? Of course I remember it. Why? Doctor, Bennett hesitated. For the first time he appeared nervous. Because Benjamin showed it to me once. Jacob waited. There was something unusual about it. The blacksmith's heart skipped a beat. A hidden compartment? The old doctor looked surprised. You found it? Not yet. But I noticed the seam. Doctor? Bennett slowly nodded. Benjamin told me he hid something inside. Jacob stared at him. What? He never said. You're certain? Completely. The revelation changed everything. Suddenly, the strange seam made sense. The medal wasn't simply a keepsake, it was hiding something. Something Benjamin Harper considered important enough to protect for decades. Meanwhile, across town, Emily was helping Miss Turner organize books inside the schoolhouse. Most of the children had not yet arrived. The room felt peaceful. For the first time since her expulsion, Emily almost felt normal again. Then the front door opened. The conversation stopped immediately. Councilman Victor Grayson entered. His expression turned cold the moment he saw Emily. I thought I made myself clear. Miss Turner stood. She's helping me. She's banned from this school. Emily lowered her eyes. The familiar shame returned. Victor stepped closer. Perhaps you misunderstood my instructions. Miss Turner surprised both of them by refusing to back down. Perhaps your instructions were wrong. The councilman's face reddened. Be careful. No, she replied. You, be careful. Victor seemed stunned. Few people ever challenged him publicly. He turned toward Emily. You think you're welcome here now? Emily said nothing. You're not. Before he could continue, several parents entered with their children. Victor immediately changed his tone. He smiled politely and tipped his hat. The transformation was so sudden that it seemed almost rehearsed. Emily noticed. Miss Turner noticed too. The moment Victor left, the teacher turned to the girl. Did you see that? Emily nodded. He acts differently when people are watching. Miss Turner frowned thoughtfully. People with secrets often do. Back at the doctor's office, Jacob prepared to leave. Before he reached the door, Dr. Bennett stopped him. Jacob. What? If you're going to investigate this, be careful. Why? The old doctor looked troubled. Because Benjamin Harper wasn't the only person hurt by what happened 20 years ago. Jacob waited. What are you saying? The doctor lowered his voice. There were powerful men involved back then. Some of them still live in Dry Creek. The warning lingered in Jacob's mind as he stepped outside. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The town looked peaceful. Children laughed. Shopkeepers opened doors. Wagons rolled through the streets. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, something darker seemed to be hiding. By late afternoon, Jacob returned to his blacksmith shop and resumed work. The rhythm of hammer against steel usually cleared his thoughts. Today it did nothing. His attention kept returning to the metal, the hidden compartment, the bravery recommendation, the conflicting testimonies, the frightened reaction from Victor Grayson. All of it pointed toward the same conclusion. Benjamin Harper had been framed. The only question was why. As sunset approached, Emily arrived carrying a basket of bread Miss Turner had given her. She smiled when she saw Jacob. The blacksmith rarely smiled back at anyone, but this time he did. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Better." "Good." Emily hesitated before speaking. "Did you learn anything?" Jacob looked at the metal hanging around her neck. The setting sun reflected off the bronze surface. "Maybe." The girl stepped closer. "About my father?" Jacob nodded slowly. "Enough to know we're asking the right questions." Hope flickered in Emily's eyes again. For years, she had searched for someone willing to defend her father's memory. Now she had found one. Neither of them realized they were being watched. Across the street, hidden behind the window of the general store, Victor Grayson observed the conversation in silence. His expression grew darker with every passing second, because for the first time in 20 years, Benjamin Harper's story was beginning to unravel, and if the truth emerged, it would destroy far more than a reputation. The following morning arrived beneath a pale sky streaked with gray clouds. The storm had finally passed, leaving Dry Creek buried beneath fresh snow that sparkled beneath the weak winter sunlight. Most townspeople welcomed the clear weather. For Jacob Walker, it brought something else entirely: determination. He opened his blacksmith shop before dawn and spent the first hour pretending to work while his mind replayed every detail he had learned during the past 2 days. Benjamin Harper's bravery recommendation, the hidden compartment inside the metal, the conflicting testimonies from surviving soldiers, the nervous reaction from Victor Grayson. None of it felt like coincidence. Somewhere beneath years of lies rested a truth powerful enough to frighten some of the town's most influential men. Jacob intended to find it. Meanwhile, Emily Harper helped Miss Turner prepare the schoolhouse for another day of lessons. Although she was technically banned from attending classes, the teacher continued finding excuses to keep her nearby. Emily swept floors, organized books, and repaired damaged papers. It wasn't much, but it gave her purpose. More importantly, it gave her a place where she felt wanted. As she worked, she found herself thinking constantly about her father. For years, she had accepted the story everyone told. Now that story seemed to be cracking apart. Every small revelation felt like a light appearing in a dark tunnel. Yet fear accompanied that hope. What if Jacob discovered nothing? What if the town had been right all along? Shortly before noon, Jacob arrived at the schoolhouse. Miss Turner immediately noticed the serious expression on his face. "You found something," she said. Jacob nodded. "Maybe." Emily stopped what she was doing and looked up eagerly. The blacksmith reached into his coat and removed a folded piece of paper. "I spent most of the night searching through old county records." Miss Turner frowned. "County records? Property records? Tax records? Military correspondence?" Emily blinked. "Why?" Jacob hesitated before answering. "Because I wanted to know who benefited from Benjamin Harper's downfall." The room fell silent. "Did someone?" Miss Turner asked quietly. Jacob unfolded the document and placed it on a desk. "Look at this." The teacher examined it first. Her eyes widened almost immediately. Emily could not understand the legal language. "What does it mean?" she asked. Miss Turner looked stunned. "The year after your father's conviction, several hundred acres of land changed ownership." Jacob nodded. "Land that originally belonged to families who supported Benjamin Harper." Emily frowned. "I don't understand." Jacob pulled up a chair. "Years ago, before your father was accused, several ranchers were involved in a dispute over grazing rights. Benjamin testified against some very powerful men." Emily listened carefully. "Which men?" Jacob exchanged a glance with Miss Turner. "One of them was Victor Grayson's father." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Emily stared at him. "You mean Victor's family hated my father before the trial?" "That's exactly what I mean." For the first time, a possible motive began to emerge. Benjamin Harper had not simply been accused of wrongdoing. He had made enemies. dangerous enemies. The realization sent a chill through all three of them. Across town, Victor Grayson sat inside his office reading a letter that had arrived by stagecoach. His mood worsened with every line. A knock interrupted him. One of the ranchers entered. "Walker has been digging through records." Victor folded the letter. "I know. Should we be worried?" The councilman stood and walked toward the window. Outside, townspeople moved through the snowy streets, unaware of the tension building beneath the surface of their peaceful community. "He's getting closer than I expected." "Then stop him." Victor's eyes hardened. "I'm considering it." Back at the schoolhouse, Jacob prepared to leave when Emily suddenly spoke. "Can we open the metal?" Both adults turned toward her. The question had been lingering in everyone's mind. Jacob looked thoughtful. "Possibly." Emily touched the bronze decoration hanging around her neck. "If something is hidden inside, maybe that's where the answers are." Miss Turner looked nervous. "What if opening it damages whatever's inside?" Jacob considered the concern. "Then we need to be careful." The blacksmith stared at the metal for several seconds. Finally, he nodded. "Bring it to my shop after school." Emily felt her heart begin to race. The hidden compartment represented more than a mystery. It represented proof. Proof that her father had trusted someone would eventually uncover the truth. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. Every minute felt longer than the one before. By sunset, Emily and Miss Turner arrived at the blacksmith shop. Jacob had already prepared a workbench beneath the brightest lantern. The metal sat at the center. The room felt strangely quiet, almost sacred. Jacob carefully examined the seam again. Years of experience working with delicate metal allowed him to see details others missed. He selected a thin tool and began working around the edge. Minutes passed. Sweat formed on his forehead, despite the cold. Emily barely breathed. Then a tiny click echoed through the room. Everyone froze. Jacob slowly separated the back portion of the metal. Inside rested something folded so tightly it appeared no larger than a thumbnail. A piece of paper. Emily's eyes filled with tears. There really was something inside. Jacob carefully removed the paper. Age had turned it yellow and fragile. The folds threatened to crumble at the slightest touch. With extraordinary care, he unfolded it. The three of them leaned closer. A handwritten message appeared. The ink had faded, but most of the words remained readable. Jacob began reading aloud. "If you are reading this, then the truth has survived longer than I expected." Emily's breath caught. It was her father's handwriting. She recognized it instantly. Jacob continued. "My name is Sergeant Benjamin Harper. I have been accused of betraying my unit. I swear before God that I am innocent." Tears streamed down Emily's face. Miss Turner covered her mouth. Jacob's hands trembled slightly. The letter continued. Benjamin described the mission. He described discovering a secret arrangement involving military supplies and stolen money. He described reporting what he had learned. And then came the most shocking line of all. Benjamin claimed a respected local businessman had been involved in the scheme. The name itself had faded almost completely. Only a few letters remained visible. Enough to identify nothing, yet enough to prove everything. Someone had silenced Benjamin Harper because he knew too much. The room remained silent long after Jacob finished reading. Finally, Emily whispered, "My father told the truth." Jacob nodded slowly. "I think he did." None of them realized that outside the shop, hidden beyond the glow of the lantern light, a figure stood watching through the darkness. The moment the metal opened, years of buried secrets had begun resurfacing, and somewhere in Dry Creek, someone was becoming desperate enough to do anything to keep them hidden. By the time dawn reached Dry Creek, the secret inside Benjamin Harper's metal had changed the shape of the town without anyone beyond Jacob Walker's shop knowing why. Emily Harper sat beside Miss Turner in the small storage room behind the schoolhouse, unable to stop staring at the folded letter laid carefully on the table between them. The paper looked too fragile to carry the weight of so much pain, yet every faded line seemed to breathe with her father's voice. "I swear before God that I am innocent." Those words had repeated in Emily's mind all night. She had slept only in scattered pieces, waking each time with the same fear that the letter might vanish before morning, that she might open her eyes and discover it had only been another desperate dream. But the letter remained. Her father had left proof, not enough to clear his name completely, not yet, but enough to prove that he had died fighting to be heard. Miss Turner poured a small cup of coffee and placed it before Jacob, who had arrived before sunrise carrying the metal wrapped in a clean cloth. "We need to know whose name was faded from the letter," she said quietly. Jacob nodded. His eyes were tired, but his expression had hardened with purpose. The last letters looked like sun. Emily frowned. "Grayson?" The room went still. Miss Turner looked toward the window as if afraid someone might be listening. Jacob did not answer immediately. "It could be. Or it could be another name. We can't accuse Victor or his family without proof." Emily lowered her eyes. She wanted proof more than she had ever wanted anything. For years, people had accused her father with full certainty while offering her no mercy. Yet now that she had a chance to defend him, every step had to be careful, every word measured, every truth earned. "Then where do we find it?" she asked. Jacob unfolded another document, the old military ledger he had found in his shop. Benjamin wrote that he reported stolen army supplies before he was arrested. If those supplies were sold through Dry Creek, someone kept records. Miss Turner leaned closer. "The freight office? Maybe. Or the old warehouse near the railroad spur." Emily remembered the place. It stood beyond the livery stable, abandoned for years, its windows cracked and its loading doors chained shut. As a younger child, she had been warned never to go near it. Most children had. That warning suddenly seemed less like caution and more like concealment. "Who owns it now?" Miss Turner asked. Jacob's mouth tightened. "Victor Grayson." A heavy silence followed. Outside, the town bell rang. Morning had begun. Children would soon arrive for school. Shops would open. Dry Creek would pretend to be ordinary. But for Emily, nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. By mid-morning, Jacob walked to the freight office under the pretense of asking about a shipment of iron rods. The clerk behind the counter, a nervous man named Mr. Pell, barely looked up from his account book. "No shipment today, Walker." "I'm not here about today," Jacob said. "I'm looking for old freight records." 20 years back, Mr. Pell's pen stopped moving. 20 years? Army supply shipments? Wagons? Ammunition crates? Uniforms? Grain? Anything marked for military transport. The clerk's face grew pale. "Why would you need something like that?" Jacob studied him carefully. "Because a dead man may have been blamed for something he didn't do." Mr. Pell swallowed. "Old records are gone." "All of them?" "Most." "Where did the rest go?" The clerk looked toward the door. "You should leave. Pell, please." The man's voice trembled. "I have a family." Jacob understood then. The clerk knew something, or at least knew enough to be afraid. Before Jacob could press further, the door opened behind him. Victor Grayson entered with 2 men at his back. "Business at the freight office, Jacob?" Victor asked smoothly. Jacob turned. "Looking for old records. Dangerous habit. Reading? Digging." Victor walked closer, smiling without warmth. "Some men mistake buried bones for treasure." Jacob held his gaze. "And some men bury them because they fear what they'll say if found." "Mister." Pell stared at the counter, refusing to breathe. For a moment, the 2 men faced each other in tense silence. Then Victor stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "I suggest you return to your forge. Iron is safer than old accusations." Jacob left without another word, but the encounter had told him enough. The freight office records mattered. That afternoon, Emily remained at the schoolhouse while Miss Turner taught lessons. She sat near the back, not as a student, but as a helper, mending torn primers with paste and thread. Some children still avoided looking at her. Others watched curiously. A younger boy named Caleb, the same one who had bumped into her near the trough, slipped a biscuit onto her desk when no one was watching. Emily looked up in surprise. Caleb gave a tiny shrug and returned to his seat before his older brother noticed. It was such a small kindness, but it nearly broke her heart. For months, she had believed the whole town hated her. Now she began to wonder if some people were simply afraid. Near sunset, Jacob returned to the schoolhouse and spoke privately with Miss Turner. Emily listened as he described Mr. Pell's fear and Victor's sudden appearance. "He followed you?" Miss Turner asked. "Or had someone watching?" Jacob looked toward Emily. "Either way, he knows we're looking." Emily touched the metal beneath her coat. Then we have to look faster. The blacksmith almost smiled at her courage, though concern shadowed his eyes. Tonight, I want you to stay with Miss Turner. Keep the metal hidden. What are you going to do? Visit the warehouse. Miss Turner immediately shook her head. Alone? Fewer people means fewer footsteps. It also means no help if someone catches you. Jacob had no answer to that. When darkness fell, Dry Creek sank into quiet. Lanterns glowed in windows. Smoke curled from chimneys. The saloon piano played faintly at the far end of town. Jacob waited until the streets emptied before making his way toward the old warehouse near the railroad spur. He carried no lantern at first, only a small, covered flame tucked inside his coat. The warehouse loomed ahead, black against the moonlit snow. Its boards were weathered, its roof sagging in places. But the lock on the main door was new. That alone told Jacob something. He circled to the rear and found a broken loading window, half covered by a loose plank. With some effort, he slipped inside. The air smelled of dust, old wood, and rusted iron. He uncovered the lantern flame just enough to see. Most of the warehouse appeared empty. But in the far corner, behind stacked crates, he found a small, locked cabinet built into the wall. The lock was old. Jacob had repaired enough hinges and clasps to open it quietly with a narrow tool. Inside rested several bundles of papers tied with cord. Freight manifests, purchase slips, shipping receipts. His heart began to pound. He searched quickly, scanning dates from 20 years earlier. Then he found one marked with a military seal. Several crates of Army rifles and ammunition had been diverted through Dry Creek under civilian ownership. The receiving signature was faded but readable. Grayson Trading Company. Jacob felt the truth sharpen into something dangerous. Benjamin Harper had discovered stolen military supplies. The Graysons had profited from them. The accusation of treason had silenced him. Jacob tucked the manifest into his coat. Then a floorboard creaked behind him. He froze. A voice spoke from the darkness. "I warned you to stop digging." Jacob turned slowly. Victor Grayson stood near the entrance with a revolver in his hand. Behind him waited two ranch hands, their faces hidden beneath hat brims. The lantern flame trembled between them. Victor's eyes dropped to Jacob's coat, where the manifest was hidden. "Hand it over," he said. Jacob did not move. "So it was your family." Victor's face hardened. "My father built this town. On stolen supplies and a framed soldier's grave." One of the ranch hands stepped forward, but Victor raised a hand to stop him. "You have no idea what you're stirring up." Jacob's voice remained steady. "I know enough." Victor lifted the revolver slightly. "Then you know too much." Outside the warehouse, the wind moved across the railroad tracks like a warning. Back at the schoolhouse, Emily suddenly woke from uneasy sleep with the metal cold against her chest and a terrible feeling she could not explain. Somewhere in the darkness, the man who had finally believed her father was standing face to face with the truth, and the truth had just become deadly. Victor Grayson kept the revolver steady in his hand, while the lantern light shook across the walls of the old warehouse. Jacob Walker stood beside the open cabinet with the stolen freight manifest hidden inside his coat, and for a long moment neither man moved. The two ranch hands behind Victor waited like shadows, their faces half covered beneath their hats. Outside, the wind dragged loose snow across the railroad tracks, but inside the warehouse the air felt heavy and still. Jacob could hear his own heartbeat. He could also hear the faint creak of the old boards beneath Victor's boots as the councilman took one step closer. "Hand it over," Victor said again. "There is no reason for this to become unpleasant." Jacob looked at the revolver, then at the man holding it. "It became unpleasant 20 years ago when your family let an innocent soldier carry your crime to his grave." Victor's eyes flashed. "You don't know what happened. I know enough." "No," Victor said, his voice tightening. "You found one paper and built yourself a noble story. That's what men like you do. You see a child crying and decide the world must bend to your pity." Jacob's jaw hardened. "This isn't about pity. Then what is it about?" "Truth." Victor laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Truth is what people believe after powerful men finish speaking." The words told Jacob more than Victor intended. This was not merely guilt. It was arrogance hardened by years of getting away with it. Jacob slowly reached into his coat. One ranch hand raised his rifle. Victor lifted the revolver higher. Careful. Jacob removed the folded freight manifest with 2 fingers and held it in plain sight. Victor's gaze fixed on it, put it on the floor. Jacob bent slightly, but instead of setting the paper down, he let the lantern near his feet tip sideways. The flame did not spill free, but the sudden motion startled the horses tied outside. One whinnied loudly and jerked against its post. The ranch hands turned toward the noise for half a breath. It was enough. Jacob hurled the manifest into the dark rafters, then lunged into Victor, driving the councilman backward against a stack of crates. The revolver fired. The sound exploded through the warehouse. Splinters burst from a beam above Jacob's shoulder. One ranch hand rushed forward. Jacob swung his heavy fist and struck him hard enough to send him crashing into the cabinet. The second man grabbed Jacob from behind, but the blacksmith drove his elbow back and twisted free. Victor stumbled to his feet, furious now, snow and dust clinging to his coat. "You fool," he hissed. "You have no idea what you've done." Jacob reached for the manifest where it had fallen near the base of a crate, but Victor saw it too. Both men moved at once. Jacob reached it first, shoved it inside his shirt, and charged toward the rear window. A rifle butt struck his side before he could climb through. Pain tore through him. He dropped to one knee. The ranch hand raised the rifle again, but before he could strike, a shout sounded from outside. "Who's in there?" The voice belonged to Mr. Pell from the freight office, and though it trembled with fear, it carried loudly enough to make everyone freeze. A second voice followed from farther down the tracks. "I heard a shot!" Lanterns appeared in the distance. Victor's expression changed instantly. He could threaten one blacksmith in an empty warehouse. He could not explain a gunshot to half the town. "This isn't over," he whispered. Jacob used the distraction to throw himself through the rear window, crashing into the snow outside. Glass and splinters cut his coat and hands, but he forced himself up and staggered toward the shadowed side of the building. Behind him, Victor cursed. Another shot rang out, but it went wide. Jacob ran. Each breath burned. Each step sent pain through his ribs. He crossed behind the livery stable, stumbled past stacked barrels, and slipped into an alley near the closed bakery. The town was waking in confusion. Men stepped from doorways carrying lanterns. Dogs barked. Somewhere behind him, Victor's voice rose in false outrage, already crafting a lie before the smoke had cleared. Jacob knew he could not go back to his shop. That would be the first place they searched. He also knew he could not keep the manifest on him if he was caught. He needed to get it to someone Victor would not immediately suspect. Miss Turner. At the schoolhouse, Emily sat awake on the floor beside the small stove while Miss Turner tried unsuccessfully to convince her to sleep. The girl could not shake the terrible feeling that something had gone wrong. Then came the gunshot. Both of them froze. A second shot followed minutes later. Emily jumped to her feet. "Jacob." Miss Turner grabbed her arm. "We don't know that." But her face showed she feared the same thing. A frantic knock struck the rear door. Miss Turner rushed to open it, and Jacob nearly fell inside. Emily gasped when she saw blood on his hands, and a dark bruise already forming along his cheek. "Mr. Walker!" Jacob leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "Lock the door." Miss Turner did so immediately. What happened? Jacob pulled the folded freight manifest from beneath his shirt and placed it on the table. "Proof." Emily stared at the document as if it were alive. "Is it about my father?" Jacob nodded. "Stolen army supplies. Signed through Grayson Trading Company. Your father found out, and they framed him before he could expose them." Emily's face went pale. She touched the metal beneath her coat. Her father's letter had been true. Completely true. Miss Turner read the manifest, her hands trembling. This could clear Benjamin's name. "Not by itself," Jacob said. "Victor will claim it's forged or stolen." "Then, what do we need?" Emily asked. Jacob winced as he straightened. "A witness." Miss Turner looked toward the window. "Mr. Pell? He knows something, but he's terrified." Emily's voice was small but steady. "Then we have to make him less afraid than he is now." Jacob looked at her with quiet surprise. There was still fear in the child, but something else had begun rising beside it. Courage. The kind her father must have carried. Before anyone could answer, voices sounded outside the schoolhouse. Horses stopped in the street. Boots stepped onto the porch. Victor Grayson's voice called through the door, smooth and cold. "Miss Turner, open up. We're looking for a dangerous man." Emily instinctively reached for the metal. Jacob looked around the room, searching for another exit. There was none. Miss Turner folded the freight manifest and slipped it into Emily's satchel beneath a stack of school papers. Then she placed one hand on the girl's shoulder and whispered, "Whatever happens, do not let them find it." The pounding on the door grew louder. "Open this door now," Victor demanded. Jacob stood despite the pain in his ribs. Emily swallowed hard, clutching the satchel against her chest. For the first time in her life, the town's most powerful man was not merely trying to drive her away. He was trying to bury the truth she carried. And as the door shook beneath another heavy blow, Emily understood that her father's fight had finally become her own. The pounding on the schoolhouse door continued with such force that dust drifted from the ceiling beams. Emily Harper clutched the satchel against her chest while Miss Turner stood between her and the entrance. Jacob Walker remained near the stove, one hand pressed against his injured ribs, his jaw tight with pain. Outside, Victor Grayson had abandoned all pretense of politeness. "Open this door!" he shouted. "By authority of the town council!" The words echoed through the empty schoolhouse. Emily felt her heart hammering. Just days earlier, she had been a frightened orphan trying to survive another winter. Now she carried evidence capable of destroying the most powerful family in Dry Creek. The realization frightened her more than Victor's threats. Miss Turner looked toward Jacob. "What do we do?" Jacob studied the room quickly. The schoolhouse had only one main exit, but there was a narrow coal chute near the rear storage room that opened behind the building. It was rarely used anymore, yet it remained large enough for a child. He pointed toward it. "Emily." She looked up. "Take the satchel and leave through the chute." Her eyes widened. "What about you? We'll keep Victor occupied." "I'm not leaving you, you have to." Jacob's voice softened. "The papers matter more than any of us right now." Emily wanted to argue, but deep down she knew he was right. Benjamin Harper's name depended on those documents surviving. So did the truth. Another violent blow shook the door. The hinges groaned. Victor was running out of patience. Miss Turner knelt beside Emily and adjusted the girl's scarf. Her eyes glistened with emotion. "Go to Dr. Bennett's house." Emily nodded reluctantly. "And if they ask where you went, they won't hear it from me." Before the girl could respond, the door burst inward. Victor Grayson stormed inside with two ranch hands. Snow swirled behind them. Victor immediately scanned the room. His gaze settled on Jacob. "Where is the manifest?" Jacob folded his arms despite the pain. "Good evening to you too." Victor ignored the remark. "Search the building." The ranch hands moved immediately. One headed toward the storage room. The other began overturning desks. While their attention shifted, Emily slipped quietly through the rear doorway and disappeared into the darkness beyond the coal chute. Miss Turner stepped directly into the path of the nearest ranch hand. "This is a schoolhouse." The man shoved her aside. Jacob lunged forward instantly. Before anyone could react, he grabbed the ranch hand's coat and slammed him against a desk. Wood splintered beneath the impact. Victor drew his revolver again. "Enough!" The room froze. The councilman looked more desperate than angry now. His composure had begun to crack. "I know you found something," he hissed. "Where is it?" Jacob stared at him. "Why are you so afraid?" Victor's face hardened. "Afraid? If Benjamin Harper was truly guilty, you wouldn't need to chase an orphan girl through the snow." The accusation landed harder than any punch. For a brief second, uncertainty crossed the faces of the ranch hands. They had followed Victor for years. Few had ever seen him this desperate. Victor noticed their hesitation immediately. "Search everything," he ordered. "Now." But Emily was already gone. Outside, she crawled through the narrow chute and dropped into the snow behind the schoolhouse. The cold air struck her face. For a moment she simply stood there, listening. She could hear shouting inside. Fear told her to run. Yet another feeling had begun growing inside her during the past few days. Determination. Her father had spent years trying to tell the truth. He had died without being heard. She refused to let that happen again. Pulling the satchel tighter, she ran toward the far side of town. Snow crunched beneath her boots. The moon hung low above the prairie. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every sound made her glance behind her shoulder. Yet she kept moving. "Several streets away, Doctor." Bennett sat reading beside his fireplace when a frantic knock rattled his door. The old physician opened it to find Emily standing outside, exhausted and covered in snow. One look at her face told him everything. "They're coming, aren't they?" Emily nodded. Dr. Bennett stepped aside immediately. "Get inside." She rushed in. Moments later, he locked the door. Back at the schoolhouse, Victor's men found nothing. No manifest, no letter, no medal. The realization infuriated him. "Where is she?" he demanded. Neither Jacob nor Miss Turner answered. Victor paced across the room. His control was slipping. "You think this changes anything?" he snapped. "The town still believes Benjamin Harper was a traitor." Jacob looked directly into his eyes. Not for much longer. Victor stopped pacing. For the first time, genuine fear appeared beneath his anger. He had spent years protecting a lie. Now that lie was beginning to collapse. And lies become most dangerous when they are cornered. By dawn, rumors had already started spreading through Dry Creek. People had heard gunshots at the warehouse. They had seen Victor searching the schoolhouse. They had noticed Jacob's injuries. Nobody knew the full story. But questions were spreading faster than answers. At the general store, ranchers whispered. At the church, families exchanged concerned glances. At the railroad station, travelers heard fragments of the tale. Dry Creek had spent 20 years refusing to question Benjamin Harper's guilt. Suddenly, the town could talk about little else. Later that morning, Jacob and Miss Turner met secretly with Dr. Bennett. Emily sat beside the fireplace holding the satchel. The old physician examined the manifest carefully. His face grew pale as he read. "This is real." Jacob nodded. "Can you prove it?" "Maybe." Dr. Bennett rose and crossed to a cabinet. After several moments of searching, he returned holding a faded leather journal. "I've kept this for 20 years. Emily stared at it. "What is it?" The doctor swallowed. "My personal notes." He opened to a page dated shortly after Benjamin Harper's arrest. "I wrote down conversations with several injured soldiers." Jacob leaned closer. "The survivors?" "Yes." The physician pointed toward a passage. One of them claimed, "Benjamin tried to stop the theft." Emily felt her breath catch. Another witness. Another piece of the truth. Dr. Bennett turned several more pages, and here, Jacob read silently. His eyes widened. This soldier identified one of the civilians involved. Emily looked between them. "Who?" The old doctor hesitated. Then he spoke the name that had haunted Dry Creek for 2 decades. Thomas Grayson, Victor's father. The room fell silent. There it was. Not suspicion. Not rumor. A direct accusation recorded long before Benjamin Harper died. Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes again. Not from sadness. From vindication. Her father had not been abandoned because he was guilty. He had been abandoned because powerful men controlled the story. For the first time, she began to believe they could actually win. Yet as hope filled the room, danger continued growing elsewhere. Across town, Victor Grayson sat alone in his office. The morning sun streamed through the window, but he barely noticed. A bottle of whiskey sat unopened beside him. In his hands rested an old letter bearing his father's signature. He read it for what felt like the 100th time. Then he folded it slowly and stared into space. Because Victor knew something none of the others had yet discovered. The stolen supplies were only part of the secret. The truth about Benjamin Harper was even bigger than the evidence hidden inside the metal. And if that truth reached the town meeting scheduled for the following week, everything the Grayson family had built would collapse forever. By mid-morning, Dry Creek had become a town divided between fear and curiosity. People pretended to go about their ordinary business, but every conversation eventually returned to the same questions. Why had gunshots been fired near the old railroad warehouse? Why had Victor Grayson forced his way into the schoolhouse? Why was Jacob Walker, a man who had spent years avoiding trouble, suddenly walking through town with bruised ribs and bloodied knuckles? And why did all of it seem to lead back to the name most people had avoided speaking for nearly 20 years, Benjamin Harper? Emily sat at Dr. Bennett's kitchen table with the medal resting in front of her. Its hidden compartment opened beside the fragile letter her father had written. The freight manifest lay next to it, along with the doctor's journal. 3 pieces of evidence, 3 voices from the past. Yet Jacob knew it still might not be enough. Powerful men survive by twisting truth until ordinary people no longer knew what to believe. If they brought only papers before the town, Victor would call them forged. If they brought only memories, he would call them lies. They needed someone who had been there, someone living, someone whose testimony could not be easily dismissed. Dr. Bennett closed his journal and rubbed his tired eyes. There was one soldier, he said quietly. Jacob looked up. A survivor? The old doctor nodded. Caleb Morris. He was barely older than a boy when the mission failed. Came back with a bullet wound and a fever that nearly killed him. He was the one who told me Benjamin rode toward the fighting instead of away from it. Emily leaned forward. Where is he now? Dr. Bennett hesitated. Last I heard, he lived beyond Miller's Ridge, small cabin near the old stage road. But that was years ago. Jacob stood despite the pain in his side. Then I'm going. Miss Turner immediately shook her head. Victor will be watching the road. Then I won't take the road. Emily rose too. I'm coming. Jacob turned toward her. No. He was my father. And that's why you need to stay safe. Emily's eyes filled with hurt, but her voice remained steady. Everyone keeps telling me to stay safe while other people risk themselves for my father's truth. But he left that medal to me. If Caleb Morris knew him, I need to hear it. Jacob wanted to refuse. The prairie beyond Dry Creek was dangerous even without Victor's men searching for them. But he also saw something in Emily that reminded him of Benjamin Harper. Not stubbornness exactly, but a kind of quiet courage that pain had not managed to kill. Finally, he sighed. We leave before noon. You do exactly what I say. Emily nodded. I will. Miss Turner packed bread, dried apples, and a small blanket. Doctor, Bennett gave Jacob a bottle of liniment and warned him not to get himself killed before noon if he could help it. By the time the sun climbed above the church steeple, Jacob and Emily slipped out through the rear of the doctor's property and followed a narrow creek bed west of town. Snow muffled their steps. The air was cold enough to turn their breath white. For a long while neither spoke. Dry Creek shrank behind them until only chimney smoke marked its place on the horizon. Emily rode behind Jacob on his old bay horse, holding the satchel tightly against her chest. Inside it rested the medal, the letter, the manifest, and copies Miss Turner had made of the doctor's notes. The originals remained hidden beneath a loose floorboard at the schoolhouse. Jacob had insisted on that precaution. If Victor caught them, he would not get everything. After nearly an hour, Emily finally asked, Did my father ever talk about me? Jacob was quiet for several seconds. I didn't know him after the war, not well, but once, years ago, I saw him in town with a little girl on his shoulders. She was laughing so hard she could barely breathe. Emily smiled faintly. That was me. He looked proud. Her smile trembled. I remember that day. He bought me a ribbon from the general store. Blue. She looked down at her hands. People weren't cruel to us then. Not like later. Jacob nodded. Fear changes people. Do you think they'll ever be kind again? The question struck him harder than he expected. He looked across the frozen prairie, thinking of all the times Dry Creek had chosen silence over mercy. Some will, he said. Some already want to. They just need someone brave enough to go first. Emily considered that quietly. By afternoon, they reached Miller's Ridge, a line of low hills covered with scrub cedar and winter grass. The old stage road wound along the base of the ridge, half buried in snow. Jacob followed it until he spotted a thin thread of smoke rising from a cabin hidden among cottonwoods. That must be it, he said. They approached carefully. A mule stood in a small fenced yard. Wood was stacked neatly beside the door. The place was poor but maintained. Before Jacob could knock, the cabin door opened. An old man stepped onto the porch holding a rifle. His beard was white, his frame thin, but his eyes remained sharp. That's far enough, he called. Jacob raised both hands. Caleb Morris? The old man stiffened. Who's asking? Jacob Walker from Dry Creek. Dry Creek has brought me nothing worth answering in 20 years. Emily slipped down from the horse and stepped forward before Jacob could stop her. Please, sir. My name is Emily Harper. Caleb Morris stared at her as if he had seen a ghost. The rifle lowered slightly. Harper? Emily pulled the metal from beneath her coat. Benjamin Harper was my father. The old soldier's face changed completely. The hardness fell away, replaced by shock, grief, and something close to shame. He stepped down from the porch slowly. Ben had a daughter? Emily nodded. Caleb's eyes filled with tears. Lord, forgive me. Jacob glanced at him. For what? The old man looked at the metal, then at Emily. For living long enough to tell the truth and never finding the courage, they entered the cabin. Inside, the fire burned low. Caleb Morris sat at a small wooden table while Emily placed her father's letter before him. His hands shook as he read. When he finished, he closed his eyes. Every word is true. Emily's breath caught. Jacob leaned forward. You saw what happened? Caleb nodded slowly. I saw enough. Your father did not betray us. He tried to save us. Over the next hour, the old soldier told them the story Dry Creek had buried. Benjamin Harper had discovered that Army rifles and ammunition were being diverted from military shipments and sold privately through men connected to the Grayson Trading Company. When Benjamin reported it, he was ordered to stay silent. He refused. Days later, during a night movement near the ridge, their unit was sent into an ambush. Benjamin realized too late that someone had changed the route. When the shooting began, he rode back to warn the rear wagons and pull wounded men out of the fire. Caleb had seen him drag 2 soldiers to safety. But after the battle, the official report claimed Benjamin had abandoned his post and revealed the route to enemy raiders. Who changed the route? Jacob asked. Caleb stared into the fire. Thomas Grayson carried the revised orders. Emily felt cold spread through her. Victor's father had not only stolen supplies, he had helped frame Benjamin for the ambush itself. Why didn't you testify? She whispered. Caleb looked at her with broken eyes. I tried. A man came to my hospital bed and told me if I spoke, my younger brother would disappear on the road to Kansas. I was 19, half dead, afraid. Tears slipped down his weathered cheeks. Your father came to see me before they took him away. He told me not to blame myself, said the truth had a way of waiting for brave hearts. Emily began crying quietly. Caleb reached across the table, his hand trembling. I should have been brave then. She looked at him through tears. You can be brave now. The old soldier bowed his head. For a long moment, only the fire crackled between them. Then Caleb stood with difficulty and crossed to a chest near his bed. From inside he removed a folded army dispatch sealed in oilcloth. I kept this all these years. Jacob stared. What is it? The original route order. The one Benjamin was supposed to follow. It was never the route that led to the ambush. He placed it on the table beside the metal. Thomas Grayson's revised order sent us into the killing ground. Jacob understood immediately. This was the missing piece. Proof of sabotage. Proof of wrongful conviction. Proof that Benjamin Harper had been sacrificed to protect criminals. Emily touched the oilcloth as if afraid it might vanish. Will you come back to Dry Creek with us? Caleb looked toward the window. Outside, winter light was fading fast. Yes, he said quietly. I've been hiding from one dead man's courage long enough. But none of them saw the rider watching from the ridge above the cabin. One of Victor's men had followed their trail after all. As Caleb packed his few belongings and Jacob prepared the horse for the return journey, the rider turned toward Dry Creek at a gallop. By nightfall, Victor Grayson would know that the last living witness had been found. And once he knew, he would stop pretending this was only a matter of reputation. Now, it was a battle for survival. The ride back to Dry Creek began under a sky the color of cold steel. Jacob Walker led the horse along the old stage road, while Emily Harper rode beside Caleb Morris in a borrowed wagon pulled by the old soldier's mule. The winter wind swept across the prairie in long, lonely gusts, rattling the dry grass and carrying distant clouds of snow over the hills. None of them spoke much during the first hour. Each was lost in thought. Emily kept replaying Caleb's testimony in her mind. Her father had not abandoned his men. He had ridden toward danger. He had tried to save lives. Everything she had been told since childhood had been a lie. Every insult, every cruel stare, every door closed in her face. The realization hurt almost as much as it healed. Jacob, meanwhile, could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. Twice he stopped and scanned the ridges behind them. Twice he saw nothing, yet his instincts, sharpened by years of hard living, refused to settle. Caleb seemed equally uneasy. The old soldier glanced behind them often, his weathered face growing more troubled with each passing mile. Finally, as the sun began sinking lower, he spoke. "Victor knows." Jacob looked over. "About us finding you?" Caleb nodded. "Men like him always know." Emily tightened her grip on the satchel containing the evidence. "Then we have to reach town before they do." Caleb offered a sad smile. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." Several miles away, Victor Grayson sat inside his office, listening to the report from the ranch hand who had followed Jacob's trail. The man stood nervously near the door while Victor stared out the window toward the distant prairie. "You're certain?" Victor asked quietly. "I saw them enter the cabin." "And Caleb Morris came with them?" "Yes." Victor closed his eyes briefly. For 20 years he had managed to keep the past buried. Witnesses moved away. Records disappeared. People forgot. Now everything was unraveling because an orphan girl refused to stop carrying her father's medal. "Get Mason and Reed," Victor said, "and tell them to meet me at Black Creek Crossing." The ranch hand swallowed. "What are we doing?" Victor finally turned toward him. The coldness in his eyes made the man wish he had never asked. "Finishing something my father should have finished 20 years ago." By late afternoon, Jacob's uneasiness had grown into certainty. Someone was following them. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. A fresh horseshoe print where no traveler should have been. A distant movement atop a ridge. A crow startled into flight by something unseen. He slowed his horse and moved closer to Caleb's wagon. "We're not alone." Caleb's expression darkened. "I know." Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. "Victor?" Jacob nodded. "Most likely." The road ahead narrowed as it approached Black Creek Crossing, a shallow river cutting through rocky terrain. Normally it was an easy passage. Today it looked like a trap. The creek itself had partially frozen, leaving patches of dark water flowing between sheets of ice. Steep embankments rose on either side. There would be little room to maneuver if trouble appeared. Jacob scanned the area carefully. Too carefully. That alone told Emily everything she needed to know. Then she saw them. 3 riders emerged from behind the rocks ahead. Another 2 appeared behind them. The trap closed silently. Victor Grayson rode at the center of the group. His horse stepped forward slowly as though he had all the time in the world. "Evening," he called. Jacob guided his horse between the riders and the wagon. "Move aside." Victor smiled. "I'd rather talk." Caleb climbed down from the wagon despite his age. "There's nothing left to discuss." Victor looked at him with open disappointment. "I should have known you'd eventually find your conscience. Better late than never." The councilman's smile vanished. "You had 20 years to tell your story." Caleb's voice grew stronger. "And now I will." Victor's hand rested near his revolver. "No, you won't." The threat hung in the air like approaching thunder. Emily felt fear rising inside her, but she forced herself not to look away. This was the man who had destroyed her father's life. The man who had spent years ensuring she suffered for it. Jacob slowly dismounted. "This ends today, Victor." Victor laughed softly. "You still don't understand. The town trusts me. They always will." Caleb stepped forward. "Not after they hear the truth." "Whose truth?" Victor snapped. "A frightened old soldier who waited 20 years? A blacksmith with stolen papers? An orphan desperate to believe her father was a hero?" Emily flinched. The words struck hard because they targeted every insecurity she carried. Victor saw it and pressed harder. The town already knows who Benjamin Harper was. Before anyone else could speak, Emily found her voice. "No," she said quietly. Every head turned toward her. The girl stepped out from behind the wagon. Her hands trembled, but her eyes remained steady. "They only know what your family told them." Victor stared at her. For a moment he seemed genuinely surprised. He had spent years viewing Emily as a helpless child. Suddenly she was standing before him without fear. "You're brave," he said coldly. "Just like your father." Emily lifted the medal hanging around her neck. The fading sunlight glinted against the bronze. "Then maybe that's why you're afraid of both of us." The words hit their mark. Jacob saw Victor's expression change instantly. Beneath the anger, beneath the confidence, there was fear. Real fear. Because Emily had spoken the truth. None of this would have been necessary if Victor believed the lies could survive scrutiny. He was fighting because he knew they could not. One of the riders shifted nervously in his saddle. Another glanced toward Caleb. Doubt was spreading. Victor noticed it too. He drew his revolver. The motion was quick enough to send the horses snorting nervously. Enough. The creek fell silent. Give me the documents. No one moved. Now. Jacob stepped slightly in front of Emily. Caleb stood beside him. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then a new voice echoed across the crossing. Put the gun down, Victor. Every head turned. Riding toward them from the eastern trail came half a dozen townspeople. At their head sat Dr. Bennett. Beside him rode Miss Turner. Behind them came Mr. Pell from the freight office, the young baker who had once chased Emily away, and several ranchers Jacob recognized. Victor's face went pale. What is this? Dr. Bennett stopped his horse. People asking questions. Mr. Pell swallowed hard before speaking. I found more freight records. Miss Turner held up a stack of papers. And copies of the manifest. The baker cleared his throat. Word spread. One by one, more riders appeared on the road behind them. Curious townspeople. Men and women who had heard rumors and wanted answers. Victor looked around and realized something terrible. The truth was no longer hidden in a single satchel. It was spreading beyond his control. Fear flickered across his face for the first time. Caleb Morris stepped forward and pointed directly at him. Your father framed Benjamin Harper. The words echoed across the crossing. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked away. The silence itself felt like a verdict. Victor slowly lowered the revolver. Not because he wanted to, because he understood the battle had changed. He could intimidate individuals. He could not intimidate an entire town once people began questioning him. Yet, as the crowd gathered and whispers spread through the cold evening air, Victor still carried one final secret. A secret hidden inside the letter he kept locked in his office. A secret so devastating that if it became public, everything Dry Creek believed about the Grayson family would collapse overnight. And for the first time in 20 years, Victor Grayson realized he might not be able to stop it. The following morning, the entire town of Dry Creek seemed to awaken beneath a cloud of tension. Word of the confrontation at Black Creek Crossing had spread faster than any stagecoach. By sunrise, people were already gathering outside the general store, the church, and the railroad station, exchanging rumors in hushed voices. Some claimed Jacob Walker had uncovered proof of corruption. Others insisted Victor Grayson had been falsely accused by jealous enemies. But for the first time in 20 years, the people of Dry Creek were no longer speaking about Benjamin Harper as though his guilt were an unquestionable fact. They were asking questions. And questions were exactly what Victor Grayson feared most. Emily Harper stood beside the window of Dr. Bennett's house watching townspeople pass through the snowy streets. Her father's medal hung around her neck. She touched it often now, not because she needed comfort, but because it reminded her why she could not quit. For years she had survived by enduring. Now she was fighting. Across the room, Jacob Walker studied the collection of evidence spread across the table. Benjamin's hidden letter, the freight manifests, Dr. Bennett's journal, Caleb Morris's original route order. Together they formed a powerful story. But stories alone did not bring justice. They needed a public reckoning. They needed the truth spoken aloud where everyone could hear it. The town meeting is tonight, Miss Turner said quietly. Half the county will be there. Caleb Morris nodded from his chair near the stove. The old soldier looked exhausted from the journey, yet there was determination in his eyes. Then that's where I tell them what happened. Jacob looked at him carefully. Victor will try to stop you. Caleb laughed softly. He already had 20 years. I'm done being afraid. Emily smiled for the first time that morning. The old soldier reminded her of the father she barely remembered. Not because they looked alike, but because they carried the same stubborn courage. Meanwhile, Victor Grayson sat alone inside his office, staring at the final letter left behind by his father. The paper had yellowed with age. The handwriting had faded. Yet every word remained clear. Thomas Grayson had written it shortly before his death. Victor had spent years hiding it from the world, years convincing himself that protecting his family's legacy justified everything that followed. But now, as the walls closed around him, he could no longer ignore the truth. The letter was not merely evidence. It was a confession. And if it became public, there would be no escaping what came next. A knock interrupted his thoughts. One of his ranch foremen entered. "The town meeting is filling up." Victor folded the letter immediately. "Good. Good?" The foreman seemed confused. Victor stood slowly. "If they're demanding answers, I'll give them answers." The man hesitated. "What kind?" Victor stared toward the window. For the first time in his life, he looked tired, the only kind left. As evening approached, nearly the entire town gathered inside the church hall. Lanterns illuminated the wooden walls. Benches filled quickly. Ranchers sat beside merchants. Railroad workers stood near the back. Families crowded together. Even travelers delayed their departures to witness what everyone suspected would become the most important meeting in Dry Creek's history. Emily entered with Jacob, Miss Turner, Dr. Bennett, and Caleb Morris. Conversations stopped immediately. Dozens of eyes followed them. Some people looked curious. Others looked ashamed. A few still appeared skeptical. Emily felt her stomach tighten. She had spent years avoiding those stares. Tonight she walked directly toward them. At the front of the hall stood Judge Henry Calloway, one of the few men in the region known for genuine integrity. After hearing rumors of the growing dispute, he had agreed to oversee the meeting. He struck the table lightly with a wooden gavel. "This gathering has been called to address serious accusations involving the conviction of Sergeant Benjamin Harper." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge continued, "Every person present will have an opportunity to speak, but we will conduct ourselves with dignity." Victor Grayson entered moments later. The room grew silent again. For years he had commanded respect simply by walking into a room. Tonight felt different. Doubt followed him. He sat alone near the front. The judge turned toward Jacob. "Mr. Walker, you requested this hearing. Proceed." Jacob rose slowly. He was not a man accustomed to public speeches. Yet when he began speaking, his voice carried clearly throughout the hall. He told the story of the medal, the hidden compartment, the letter Benjamin Harper had left behind. He described the freight manifests. He explained how military supplies had been diverted through Grayson Trading Company. One by one, he presented each piece of evidence. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Faces changed. People exchanged uneasy glances. Then Dr. Bennett stood and read excerpts from his journal. He described treating wounded survivors after the failed mission. He described hearing conflicting stories. He described his growing belief that Benjamin Harper had been framed. More whispers filled the hall. Some people looked toward Victor. Others looked away. Then Caleb Morris rose from his chair. The old soldier moved slowly, but the moment he began speaking, the room fell completely silent. He described the ambush. He described Benjamin Harper riding back into danger to save trapped soldiers. He described Thomas Grayson's revised orders. He described the threats that kept him silent for 2 decades. Several people in the audience openly gasped. Others lowered their heads in shame. By the time Caleb finished, many eyes were wet with tears. Emily could barely breathe. Everything her father had tried to say was finally being heard. Judge Calloway looked toward Victor. "Do you wish to respond?" The councilman stood. Every person in the hall watched him. For several long seconds he said nothing. Then he slowly removed the folded letter from inside his coat. The sight immediately caught Jacob's attention. Victor looked at the crowd, at the judge, at Emily. Finally his gaze settled on the medal hanging around her neck. "My father wrote this before he died," he said quietly. The room remained silent. Victor unfolded the letter with trembling hands. Then he began to read. Thomas Grayson admitted participating in the theft of military supplies. He admitted manipulating records. He admitted arranging false testimony. Most devastating of all, he admitted knowingly allowing Benjamin Harper to take the blame for crimes he did not commit. Gasps echoed throughout the hall. Several townspeople covered their mouths. Others stared in disbelief. Victor's voice nearly broke as he continued. The letter described years of guilt, regret, fear. Thomas Grayson had never confessed publicly because he feared losing everything he had built. Instead, he passed the burden to his son. When Victor finished reading, silence filled the church hall, not ordinary silence. The kind that follows a truth so large it changes everyone who hears it. Judge Calloway slowly removed his glasses. Then the evidence is clear. No one argued. No one protested. The truth had become undeniable. He turned toward the crowd. Sergeant Benjamin Harper was wrongfully convicted. Tears streamed down Emily's face. Around her, townspeople began lowering their heads. Some remembered the insults they had spoken. Others remembered doors they had closed. The shame was visible. Yet the hearing was not over. Judge Calloway stood. Tomorrow morning, I will issue a formal declaration clearing Benjamin Harper's name. His military record will be restored. The county will receive copies of every document presented here tonight. A wave of emotion swept through the room. Emily felt as though she could finally breathe after years spent underwater. But then the judge looked toward Victor Grayson. And there remains the matter of responsibility. Every eye turned toward the councilman once again. Victor lowered his head. For the first time, he appeared smaller than the reputation that had protected him for so long. The judge's next words would determine his fate. And as the church hall waited in absolute silence, the final chapter of Benjamin Harper's story was about to begin. Judge Calloway's words hung over the church hall like the final toll of a bell. There remains the matter of responsibility. No one moved. No one whispered. Every eye in Dry Creek seemed fixed upon Victor Grayson, the man who had ruled their town through influence, fear, and a family name built on buried crimes. Victor stood with his father's confession still trembling in his hand. For the first time Emily Harper could remember, he did not look powerful. He looked tired, cornered, human. The judge turned to him with solemn eyes. Victor Grayson, you possessed a written confession from your father proving Sergeant Benjamin Harper was innocent. You kept it hidden while this child was cast out, shamed, and left without protection. You used your authority to threaten witnesses and interfere with the discovery of evidence. Do you deny this? Victor opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence answered for him. Judge Calloway nodded once. Then, by the authority granted to this court and county, I am ordering your immediate removal from the town council pending formal charges. You will surrender all documents related to Grayson Trading Company and remain under supervision until the county marshal arrives. A sharp murmur spread through the hall. 2 deputies stepped forward. Victor did not resist when they took his revolver. Perhaps some part of him had known this moment would come. Perhaps the weight of his father's sin had finally become too heavy to carry. As he passed Emily, he stopped briefly. Jacob moved closer, ready to step between them. But Victor only looked down at the metal around her neck. His voice was low enough that only she and those nearest could hear. Your father was braver than any of us. Emily studied him for a long moment. Part of her wanted to hate him. Part of her still did, but hatred felt too small for what had happened. Too small for 20 years of lies. Too small for the lonely nights, the hunger, the shame, and the grave her father had been given without honor. She did not forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she found one sentence steady enough to speak. Then you should have told the truth sooner. Victor lowered his eyes and allowed the deputies to lead him away. When the church doors closed behind him, the hall remained silent. Then Judge Calloway stood again. Let the record show that from this evening forward, Sergeant Benjamin Harper is cleared of all accusations of treason and cowardice. His conviction is declared wrongful. His honor is restored before this town and before God. Emily pressed both hands over her mouth. She had imagined hearing words like that, but no imagining could have prepared her for the force of them. Her father was innocent. Not secretly, not hopefully, publicly, officially. The truth had finally reached daylight. Miss Turner began crying beside her. Dr. Bennett removed his spectacles and wiped his eyes. Caleb Morris bowed his head as though a burden had fallen from his shoulders after 2 decades. Jacob placed a steady hand on Emily's shoulder. Around the hall, people slowly began to stand. Some removed their hats. Others lowered their heads. No one had instructed them to do so. It simply happened, one person at a time, until nearly the entire church hall stood in silent respect for a man they had once condemned. Emily looked at their faces and felt something complicated twist inside her. These were the same people who had ignored her hunger, the same people who had crossed the street, the same people who had let a child sleep in barns because they feared defending the daughter of a disgraced man. Yet now many wept openly. Their shame was real. Their regret was real. But so was the damage. Healing, Emily realized, did not erase what had happened. It only gave pain somewhere better to go. The next morning, Dry Creek gathered again, this time not inside the church hall, but at the small cemetery on the hill overlooking town. Snow lay across the graves in soft white sheets. Benjamin Harper's grave stood near the edge, marked by a simple wooden cross that had weathered badly over the years. The name was carved unevenly. No rank, no honor, no mention of service. Just Benjamin Harper, 1838, 1878. Emily stood before it with the medal in her hands. Beside her were Jacob, Miss Turner, Dr. Bennett, Caleb, and Judge Calloway. Behind them gathered nearly every citizen of Dry Creek. The judge read the formal declaration clearing Benjamin's name. Then Caleb stepped forward in his old, faded uniform coat. His hands shook as he pinned a restored ribbon to the medal. "Sergeant Harper saved my life," he said, his voice carrying across the cold hillside. "He saved others too. I was afraid to speak then. I speak now, so no child of his ever has to wonder whether her father was a hero." Emily's tears fell silently. Jacob then placed a new marker beside the old cross. He had forged the metal plaque himself before dawn. It read, "Sergeant Benjamin Harper, beloved father, brave soldier, wrongfully condemned, honor restored." When Emily saw the words, her knees nearly gave way. Miss Turner held her gently. One by one, townspeople approached the grave. Some left flowers. Some whispered apologies. Some could not meet Emily's eyes. The baker who had once told her to move along came forward holding a wrapped loaf of fresh bread. His voice broke as he offered it to her. "I should have helped you sooner." Emily accepted it quietly. "Thank you." Caleb stood before the grave last. He removed his hat and spoke so softly, only Emily heard him. "I kept breathing because your father saved me. I'm sorry it took me so long to repay that breath." Emily reached for his hand. "You came back." The old soldier nodded through tears. "Because you asked me to be brave." In the weeks that followed, Dry Creek changed slowly, then all at once. Victor Grayson was taken to the county seat to face charges of intimidation, obstruction, and crimes connected to the old freight records. Several men who had helped hide evidence lost their positions. Grayson Trading Company was seized pending investigation. Funds recovered from its accounts were used to pay restitution to families harmed by the stolen military supplies and the false convictions that followed. But the most important changes were smaller. The schoolhouse door opened to Emily again. On her first morning back, she stood outside the building with her satchel in hand, uncertain whether she was ready. Memories of being expelled still lingered too close to the surface. Then the door opened and Miss Turner smiled at her from the porch. "Welcome home, Emily." Inside, the children were unusually quiet. Caleb, the boy who had once slipped her a biscuit, stood and placed a blue ribbon on her desk. Others followed with small offerings: a slate pencil, a knitted scarf, a polished stone, a paper flower. None of them said much. Children often understood apology better through action than speeches. Emily sat down slowly. For the first time, no one moved away from her. That evening, Jacob waited outside the schoolhouse with his old bay horse hitched nearby. Emily stepped onto the porch, holding her books against her chest. "How was it?" he asked. She thought carefully. "Strange." Jacob nodded. "Strange can be a start." She smiled. "A good start." They walked together toward the blacksmith shop, where a small room behind the forge had been cleaned, warmed, and fitted with a narrow bed, a quilt, a shelf for books, and a wooden box for her few belongings. Jacob had asked Judge Calloway about becoming her legal guardian. The process would take time, but no one in town opposed it. Not anymore. That night, Emily stood in the doorway of the little room, unable to speak. The quilt on the bed was patched but clean. A lamp glowed warmly on the table. On the shelf sat the blue ribbon her father had once bought her, recovered from Miss Turner's sewing basket where Emily had left it years before. Jacob stood awkwardly behind her. Emily turned and hugged him before he could finish. The blacksmith froze, then gently rested one broad hand on her shoulder. Neither spoke for a while. Some promises did not need words. Spring came slowly to Dry Creek that year. Snow melted from the cemetery hill. Grass returned along the creek banks. Wagons once again crossed the main street without sinking into mud. On the first warm Sunday, the town gathered for a memorial service at Benjamin Harper's grave. This time, no shame hung over the name. Caleb Morris wore his uniform. Dr. Bennett read from Scripture. Miss Turner led the children in a hymn. Jacob stood beside Emily, his hat held against his chest. When the service ended, Judge Calloway invited Emily to place the medal on the new marker. She held it for a long time before stepping forward. The bronze caught the sunlight, no longer hidden beneath a child's coat, no longer carrying a secret alone. Emily placed it carefully at the base of the plaque. "You were right, Papa," she whispered. The truth mattered. A warm breeze moved across the hill. For a moment she imagined her father's hand resting on her shoulder. Not heavy, not sad, proud. Behind her, Dry Creek waited in respectful silence. When she turned back, Jacob was there. So were Miss Turner, Caleb Morris, and a town still learning how to become better than it had been. Emily knew the pain would not vanish. Some nights she would still remember the cold stable, the hunger, the laughter, the doors closing. But now those memories no longer stood alone. Beside them stood a forge fire, a school desk, a blue ribbon, a new grave marker, and the people who had finally chosen truth over fear. As the sun lowered over the western hills, Jacob offered his hand. Emily took it. Together they walked down from the cemetery toward Dry Creek, not as a forgotten orphan and a lonely blacksmith, but as the beginning of a family neither had expected to find. And above them, on the hill where the restored name of Benjamin Harper shone in the evening light, the medal rested in peace at last. As the sun set over Dry Creek and the name of Benjamin Harper finally stood restored beneath the open sky, one truth remained clear. Sometimes justice arrives late. Sometimes the world takes years to recognize the courage of good people. But the truth has a remarkable way of surviving, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to carry it forward. If Emily's journey touched your heart, and if you believe kindness, courage, and redemption still matter, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more forgotten trails, lonely cowboys, and extraordinary stories waiting beyond the horizon. Until our next journey together, may your road be safe, your heart remain strong, and may you never stop believing that even the smallest act of courage can change a life forever.